Hi, and welcome to a conversation with Dan Stec, a Republican candidate running to fill retiring State Senator Betty Little's 45th District seat. I'm Jared Stam, editor at Manchester Media, and I'm being joined by our reporters Jay Mullen and Austin Crozier. And we are pleased to be sitting down together in Manchester Media's offices to discuss the issues facing the residents of the 45th District and Mr. Stec's positions and plans. So thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me in.
Great. Let's get started. I'm going to ask the first question.
You got it.
Okay. So just tell us a little about yourself and why you're running for state senate.
Sure. In essence, my entire life has been one of service. My father was a Marine, and then he was a forest ranger, worked for New York State. My mom was a secretary, so both parents secretary for Queensbury High School, so both of them were public servants. The Navy helped pay for college, and I joined the Navy, became an officer, nuclear engineering, 5 years commitment, but I served 8, Persian Gulf during Desert Storm. So I served the military. When I got out of the service, I moved back home, and I decided that I wanted to be involved in what was going on in my community. So I was in the zoning board, and then I did a couple terms as a town councilman, and then 9 years as a town supervisor. And at each step I was learning more, preparing me for the next step. So it became a natural fit to run for the assembly 8 years ago, and I was elected to that. And so now I've built up a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge and know-how, my commitment to service, my commitment to the region that I was born and raised in. So it's really a sense of commitment and duty to want to serve, and also recognizing that I've built a tool chest of knowledge and skills that have served me well in public office so far. And now the senator is retiring. There's a lot more work to be done. It's an opportunity to serve a larger area, learn something new, and have a change, certainly change in what, my routine, which is always fun from a work perspective. So, for those reasons, it just seemed like a natural fit to just take and apply what I've learned in public office so far and bring it to a larger audience, a larger number of people, and hopefully do more good than I've been able to do in the offices up till then.
Terrific. Thank you.
I'm going to have your next question over here. So, kind of touching on your experience, you have a long history within, local politics. As you said, starting with the Queensbury town government. So what experience do you bring to, the table that your Democratic opponent, Kimberly Davis, does not? And how would you use those experiences to succeed within the Senate?
Well, certainly, I respect anyone that decides that they want to run for office, and anyone that serves in public office, as my opponent does. However, unlike my opponent, have been a legislator. I've been a part of a 5-member town board, a 20-member county board, 150-member state assembly. And so the job of a legislator is very unique and very different. And I've spent my career in public service working with others on that level. So the Senate is just another legislative body, just like the assembly, just like a county board or a town board. Again, only the stakes are bigger, the numbers are larger, the dollar amounts and the issues you're covering the entire state. But the 8 years that I've had in the assembly, clearly the advantage I have there is that the legislation's all the same. The players are mostly all the same. You're dealing with the same advocates, you're dealing with the same bills, whether you're in the Senate or the Assembly. There are largely a lot of overlap there. You're dealing with the second floor of the governor's office. So that the colleagues in the Senate are going to be new faces, but other than that, the process is the same, the issues are the same, and I'll be still working with all the advocacy groups in the Senate that I did in the Assembly, the same departments, DEC, Department of Health. Those don't change. So there's a tremendous amount of seamless transition. There'll be no learning curve, in comparison to somebody that wasn't already in the Assembly. And I've been there for 8 years, so I've got a long track record of achievement there, and I've built a reputation. I'm known in Albany, and so I'll be able to step into the Senate, and they'll know who I am, and they'll know how my reputation and my work ethic and my ability to work across the aisle and get things done. That's already established in Albany, so I don't need to prove that again. But thank you.
All right, Dan. Again, Austin Crozier with the Granville Sentinel. My first question for you is, what has been your greatest accomplishment as a member of the New York State Assembly for the past 7 years? And do you have any advice for either Claudia Bramer, Matt Simpson, or Evelyn Wood, who are all running to replace you?
All right, I'll answer the first part first. The greatest achievement, well, certainly we're there in Albany to legislate. All right, and so I would say that it is a true statement that in the 8 years that I've been in the Assembly, I have passed more bills.
8 years. Yeah.
8 years. In my 8 years in the Assembly, I have passed more bills than any other Assembly Republican. So I'm proud of that, and not to diminish the efforts or the achievements of my Assembly Republican colleagues, but I've gotten a lot of local bills that are important here in the region passed in the Assembly, more than any of my other Republican colleagues. But also, I think I want to emphasize the 4 constitutional amendments that I was, very deeply involved in. 3 of them were Adirondack issue related, NICO Mineral, Township 40, and the Adirondack Land Bank. And the Adirondack Land Bank had been something that had been on the drawing board for decades. It was something that was always intended to be established. But I was involved, and I was on the inner circle with members of both sides of the aisle, both the Senate and the Assembly, the second floor. I worked hand in glove with all of them to get that done, and the voters approved all 3 of those constitutional amendments. But the 4th one is perhaps one that I'm most proud of, and that was the constitutional amendment to strip corrupt officials of their pensions. The public had been very frustrated with the continuing revolving door of arrests of legislators, and they were being convicted, and yet they were still collecting their public financed pensions because the Constitution said that you could not diminish those. And that really rubbed the public the wrong way. It was an issue that I brought forward and I championed. It got attention of the media in Albany, and it took on a little bit of life of its own. And then after a process and a lot of negotiation and back and forth, it evolved into what was eventually a constitutional amendment. So, to know that I was an integral player on 4 constitutional amendments. I mean, you don't get a bigger, as a legislator, there's nothing beyond amending the state's constitution, and I was very heavily involved in 4 of those. And again, I don't think there's a single member of the Assembly that was involved in all 4 of those. So, Republican or Democrat. So I'm proud of that. The advice I would give to my 3 people that want to fill my Assembly seat, certainly, they're all current or past public officials. They've been elected before, so they certainly know how to campaign. They know what public service is about. I know all 3 of them. I know Matt the best of the 3 of them, but I served on the county board with Evelyn Wood as well for a few years. They're hard workers. They mean well. From a campaign perspective, I shouldn't be giving any of them advice. They should figure this out on their own. But you want to be accessible. Whether it's good politics and it's good policy in office, be accessible, return the calls, answer the questions, be direct, be honest. Don't string people along. But I think all 3 of them know this. I'm not telling any of them anything that they shouldn't already know. But just be a hard worker, and it'll come out. That you're sincere and you're trying to do the right thing, and just know that you're not always going to make everyone happy, and that's okay too. Some people, you never find the perfect solution where everyone's thrilled. So you got to be prepared for that, and just sometimes good enough is good enough.
So what do you think are the 3 biggest issues that are facing New York State that need to be addressed right now, and how would you address them? How would you help address them?
Well, right now in the COVID world, the number one has to be the COVID, and not only from a public health perspective and getting through that, but the economic recovery. We started the year with a $6 billion deficit before COVID. By most people's definitions, the state was already broke, but now it's $14 or $15 billion and growing. And even the governor uses the word broke to describe New York State. So the economic recovery, and with that is going to come risk for the public health. That you're trying to strike that balance between reopening economy and not spreading the virus. But I think we need to work hard to achieve that balance, because the state frankly needs the revenue. We need to make sure that people have jobs and that they're paying their mortgages and that they can afford to continue to live their life. So I think the economic recovery, and it really heightens what was already in the pre-COVID world. I would have said, that the state is in fact the most heavily taxed state in the country. We are the worst business climate in the country. So these are 2 bad things that are already working against us when we're trying to recover from COVID. And then in addition to that, and again, all related, the need for infrastructure investment, and that's not just roads and bridges, although New York State's got a fair share of issues with keeping up with roads and bridges, as do a lot of states. But water and wastewater. I was just on a water quality task force last fall that the Assembly Minority Conference put on. I was a co-chair. We traveled around the state and took testimony and input from people all over. And it's well documented that the state has about a $30 or $40 billion capital need in water and a similar one in wastewater. So you're talking $70 to $80 billion that we already need to put into water and wastewater infrastructure. But of course, the third part of infrastructure is also broadband and cell service. And as an Adirondacker, born and raised here, and recreating where I do, and traveling all over every corner of the Adirondacks in the North Country, there are a lot of coverage gaps in cell service. And broadband was already an issue, but now in COVID, it's just heightened is that now everyone is trying to use broadband at the same time. They're remote learning, they're working at home remote. So I mean, it is a lot like a pipe. A lot of people don't realize that, but it's a water pipe, and the pipe, frankly, isn't big enough. If there is a pipe in front of your house, it's not big enough to do everything that we need it to do. And now we need it not only for the routine use of broadband access, but we need it for educating our kids, economic development, because people are now working from home, and then telemedicine, property values. I mean, just all things being equal, I think people would prefer to be connected in their real estate than not connected. So I think COVID has just underscored that need even more. We allocated $500 million several years ago for the state to do a broadband project to try to get it to 100%. We're not at 100%. The governor, I think, has spiked the football a little prematurely on that. Now, unfortunately, COVID is being blamed for not, the slowing of this process. And I think that's probably a fair, there's some of that is due to COVID. But we'll probably, frankly, unfortunately, need to incentivize more of that with additional funding. And that's going to be really hard in a $14 billion world. But it's absolutely critical when you're sending kids home and you're having entire schools that need to remote teach. And it was a challenge before, and now it's now it's an even bigger challenge. So I'm not sure if I got to three there, but and then the third one I would say would be where we are with law enforcement and police. And I find it hard to believe that has become one of the number one issues nationally. Is the movement to defund the police, the bail reforms, the removing of qualified immunity, so that opening our police officers to personal liability for their public actions on the job, and the removing of 50A, I've always believed in law enforcement, but like anything, whether you're talking about religious leaders or doctors or teachers or store clerks or bus drivers, there are bad police officers too. But by and large, the vast majority of them are good. They're in it for the right reasons. They're hardworking. They occasionally make mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes are tragic. Sometimes those mistakes are criminal. And when that happens, of course you hold people accountable. But to indict the entire profession of law enforcement and saying that the whole system is broken and needs to be defunded, the solution to this problem is defunding, is ludicrous. And in this district, I think the vast majority of voters agree with that sentiment. I'm thrilled that I have been endorsed by dozens of law enforcement agencies and law enforcement officials around the state. And that's because I've been a steadfast supporter of law enforcement. I will continue to do that. And again, that doesn't mean I'm not willing to hold people accountable for breaking the law and violating the public trust. But I stand with the police that they have a difficult job to do. I want them to be successful in it. And that does not mean defunding them. Defunding them does not increase their chances of success. It increases their chances of failure. I think there's three.
Okay.
So you kind of touched on this a little bit, excuse me, in the beginning of that response when you were talking about COVID. But I'm just curious as to what your stance is on the state of the healthcare system in New York State, and just kind of what steps you think might need to be taken, or maybe might not need to be taken. Just kind of how you feel about it.
Well, I absolutely reject a public payer option. Every study that's been looked at, it is a budget buster. It is an absolute crushing hundreds of billions of dollars cost for public payer. And yet, there's legislation that's come through Albany, through the Assembly, that continues to encourage that. There's a lot that can be done through tort reform, through modifying insurance ability to get insurance across state lines that would lower costs, increasing competition. But there's a lot of waste in Medicaid. I think the federal government recently did a study where they identified more than $100 million worth of benefits were being paid to people that were dead. So it's hard to say we need to spend more money here if we're not looking in the mirror and cleaning up our own house. There's a lot of ways. There's been there's certainly billions of dollars worth of Medicaid fraud occurring, and not necessarily at the user level. Some of it's user level, but some of it is also provider level. That needs to be rooted out. I'm all for helping people, but I don't want to throw money into a bottomless pit where that certain amount of it, that there's a certain significant percentage of it that is being wasted or stolen. So I'd rather clean that up so that what money we do have going into our healthcare system is going to places it's needed and not, not being wasted or abused.
All right, Dan. You touched on it in Jared's question, but all three New York State Assembly candidates, as well as yourself, are in full support of bringing a stable broadband connection to the 114th district. As New York State Senator, how will you plan to put that plan in action?
All right. Well, again, you're right. We did touch on this, but we funded it to $500 million, and that's just at the state level. The federal government, I know there's some programs too. Our Congresswoman has been involved in getting funding there. The thing is that one of the problems that we have now is that there's a tax, the DOT right away. If they want to run fiber line down a state highway and a DOT right away, there's a significant tax that is prohibitive to private. And you got to remember that these providers are all private businesses. So really, where we are though is I think we're in a position where we need to decide, is this a public utility or not? And and while there's detractors to socializing anything or bringing anything under state control, we did have success in the regulations that we did to make sure that we were providing electricity 100 years ago everywhere. So the governor laid out a goal. It's a laudable goal. It's a goal that I support. I want 100%. And he put a caveat in there. There's an asterisk in there. And I think he's allowed to have an asterisk in there. Where it's not going to necessarily be 100 megabits. Not necessarily fiber at every house, although I certainly understand that. But when you start looking at how expensive some of these properties would be, you need to have the asterisk and say, well, some may need to be satellite or other alternative technologies. But I think that realistically, we need to look at the regulations to make sure that we aren't disincentivizing providers through making it more expensive through our own tax system. I think, and there's legislation that I'm a co-sponsor of that we put forward this spring. Unfortunately, COVID slowed down the legislative process, but I'm a co-sponsor of a bill that would do just that. And then there's been an over-reliance on these maps that were created on the census blocks, and if one house was covered in the census block, then the whole census block was covered in as being served. And my local town supervisors were screaming and begging with the broadband office for years, telling them that was not an accurate way to qualify whether or not there was service. And they kept showing them example after example of look, you're saying this is served and this is not served. I represent that town. That's my town. So I've been working with providers like Slick. I'm a big fan of the work that they've done, and they've done a really good job up north, and they're slowly coming down into the southern Adirondacks now, but they've done a great job. I've been talking with them. There's a gentleman out of Franklin County that has really volunteered a lot of time poring over these maps. And, so as state senator, I would continue to work with them and encourage the broadband office. We talk to the broadband office all the time. And I think a lot of it comes screeching to a halt because of COVID, and there's other realities right now, whether they're funding realities or just our own internal bandwidth of being able to tackle and take on these projects. But we need to keep pushing forward because we've got kids that are in school now that are relying on this. And I get asked all the time in Washington County, there's supervisors, hey, what can be done? What can be done? It's very frustrating for me knowing that this is an issue. But it's still a construction project. It's a significant, it's not a matter of just stroking a check or signing a contract. Then you still have to get work crews and engineers involved to design things, and it has to be financially viable or the providers aren't going to want to do it. So, you just got to roll up your sleeves. And have we improved it, broadband in the last 5 years? Yes. But if you're unserved, is that comforting? Not really. I get that, and I hear it all the time. And so the only thing we can do is push to keep moving forward. And I get it. If you're not provided, then my job is to move forward faster. And again, that's just working with the broadband office and our colleagues. And I think we're going to need to look at additional funding eventually.
Changing direction a little bit. What's your stance on bail reform, and also not police defunding, but police reform?
Sure. Well, the bail reform. Well, first of all, both the bail reforms in 2019 and the amendments or the improvements that were made in 2020 were both done as part of the state budget. Which maybe I'm an insider now, where I'm a technician and I'm looking at how things work and operate, but. Just as a resident, as a voter, as somebody that lives in the state, we should all be appalled at how much is occurring in the state budget. A budget should be revenues and expenses. It's a $170 billion budget in New York State, which is almost twice the budget of the state of Florida. All right, I mean, it's a big enough issue on its own merit to just have dollars and cents in there. But New York has a long, proud history of cramming in all kinds of controversial policy into a budget. They use the leverage value of $170 billion state budget to pass other reforms or improvements or policy things that have nothing to do with the budget. And bail reform in 2019 was one of them. The mistake on bail reform last year in 2019 was the arrogance that the majorities had in the legislature, and it was the majorities. The Republicans did not vote for this in either house, but the Democrats in the Senate and the Assembly went out and they significantly, fundamentally changed the state's bail structure without talking to the district attorneys, without talking to the court system, and without talking to the police. I don't know I mean, that's pretty arrogant to say that we're going to go in here, we're going to fundamentally change the system because we think it's broken, and you're not talking to the people that, if it's broken, broke it, and if it needs fixing, they're going to be the ones that have to fix it. So it was done without talking to them. It was well documented that the bail reform didn't work, that they were letting people out as a turnstile. There was one story where a guy robbed the bank 5 times in one day in New York City. That's crazy. And that was just why it was a high profile case, but there were stories. I mean, every cop that I talked to thought that this was crazy. And these aren't just people that I lock them up. These are our local sheriffs are intelligent people. They're thoughtful people. They're not gunslingers. They're well thought. They understand how the system works. And the DAs likewise are saying, at least around here, our system is working. You need to have judicial discretion. You need to have the ability to haul somebody in and hold them for bail because they might go hurt somebody. You should be able to consider the perpetrator's past history, and their likeliness to reoffend. And all that got thrown out. So I was a proponent, and I still am, of scrapping it and starting over because there were issues. That poor kid in Rikers Island that allegedly stole a backpack and sat in Rikers Island for 13 months, that's criminal. Frankly, somebody at Rikers Island should have been maybe arrested and prosecuted for what happened to that kid down there. That kid fell through the cracks, the system failed him, but it was the system in New York City and in Rikers Island that failed him. It wasn't the system in Washington County or Warren County or Essex County that failed anybody. So again, Albany is famous for a one-size-fits-all approach, whether it's gun control or whether it's bail reform or criminal justice reform, that there's an issue somewhere in New York City, and therefore the solution must be one that's applied statewide, whether we have those experiences or not. So I think that we should scrap it and start over, and this time do it the right way by involving from the get-go law enforcement, the court system, the district attorneys, and getting it right. I think there was a second part to your question.
Well, just the idea of not necessarily police defunding, but police reform.
Look, I can tell you that, it's my time in the county government, just watching hiring processes for the sheriff's office, and I know that there's a similar screening process. They go through psyche valves, they go through background checks, Now, can we do more? If we can, we should, but people aren't perfect. You're gonna, and sometimes you might hire somebody today and something changes in their life after they become a police officer, and they're not the person years later that they were when they were hired. I mean, they're still people, which means that they bring baggage with them. They bring perspectives and sometimes prejudices with them. We need to do the best we can to avoid hiring problem people in the first place. We certainly need to watch the police, and they do. They have internal affairs. They have review policies and procedures and offices of conduct where they're looking for, hey, is this person heading down the wrong path here? Is this person going to be a problem? Maybe we need to discipline them. Maybe we need to remove them. And if there's more that can be done there, I'm fine with that. But again, the call out there has been to defund the police, to take money away from the police. They took them, $1 billion away in New York City. They shut down a crime unit in New York City because they could in the middle of this year. Our state budget's already adopted. Next year, when we're working on the state budget, as sure as God made little green apples, the left side of the aisle in the Senate and the Assembly will be pushing to defund the police. I'm sure of it. I think our law enforcement agencies are sure of it, which is why our law enforcement agencies are racing to endorse Republican candidates in both houses now, because they see that the direction that the Democrats have taken the state. Not to make it too partisan, but those are the realities. I mean, the Republicans did not vote for this stuff. But no, I mean, if there's improvements to be made, of course, who's opposed to that? But the idea that because we find an occasional bad apple, that therefore the whole thing is bad and we got to scrap it or we got to defund it and start from scratch is insane. And literally that's what the Working Families Party is saying. That's the Working Families Party, and a lot of our opponents are on that party line. It's in their platform. They want to defund the police. That's a stated position that they've had as a political party.
So you did kind of, just, touch on this a little bit, but I did see recently that you ran an ad, saying that you back the blue and that it's a very important thing for you, and you made that very clear during this interview. But I'm just curious as to, why it's so important to you to show that support of the local law enforcement throughout the state, not just, in this area, but in, New York City as well.
Well, when 23, because it's unprecedented, NYPD has never endorsed a presidential candidate before, and they made an endorsement this year. 23 police agencies from around the state decided together that they wanted to make endorsements in state Senate races, and I was one of the Senate candidates at this group of 23 from around the state. The New York State Police Troopers and the Troopers Investigator Association have both endorsed me. The Corrections Officers Union endorsed me. Council 82 endorsed me. They're statewide, but there's a lot of members of Council 82 in NYSCOPA, and the troopers that live in the North Country live in the district. But Sheriff Murphy and Sheriff LaFar and Sheriff Reynolds in Essex County and Sheriff Mulverhill in Franklin County and Sheriff Big Wharf in St. Lawrence County, they've all personally endorsed me. So the local sheriffs have endorsed me. And why, so I want people to know that, because I think the vast majority of our voters, regardless of their political affiliation, believe that public safety is important. I'm a father of a 15-year-old, all right, and so guess what? He's got a lot of friends, and the parents all know each other, and we get together and we socialize together, and so I have a lot of contact with a lot of parents of kids, just as a person, not as a legislator. And they care about public safety. They want to they like their cops. They like knowing that the law enforcement is respected in the North Country and around here and listened to. Finer people than, Sheriff Murphy or Sheriff LaFar locally here in Warren, Washington County, you're not going to meet. And everyone in their department, they're good people. And the public wants them on the street, and they want them well funded, and they want them respected and listened to, because they know that they have a tough job to do, but they do it well. So public safety, and again, this is something we used to take for granted, but now all of a sudden, and before COVID, it was the bail reform. That was the public safety and criminal justice issue. But now, more recently, we've got a active movement to defund police. It's already started to happen in New York, and I think there are people around here like New York City, and I think people around here are like, well, we don't want that creeping up the Northway into our communities here. So. I think for a lot of people, public safety is going to be a factor in their decision to vote this year. And, I want to make it crystal clear, that I have always been and always will support our police. That's not to say that they get a blank check. As I said previously, if there's something that's wrong and needs to be fixed, or if there's an individual that crossed the lines and needs to be disciplined or prosecuted, of course. But, the idea that, so the police are the problem makes no sense to me.
Now, this is the follow-up question to Jay and Jared. These issues seem to go hand in hand these days, but what is your stance on the Black Lives Matter movement? Well,
all lives matter. I respect. I don't care. What person's age, sex, color, religious beliefs, veteran status. They're all human beings. They all need to be treated with respect. Every life matters. I think that the Black Lives Matter as a movement, the Black Lives Matter has a political connotation to it, a Marxist connotation to the movement. But I want to separate the political aspect of Black Lives Matter as a separate issue, and just say, look, the idea is all lives matter. Whether you're young or old, good person, bad person, black or white, male or female, gay or straight. Every life matters, and my commitment is to every single life, period.
So you talk about ethics reform.
Yes.
Any continuing plans for continuing ethics reform in the Senate and for the state of New York?
Yeah, well, the transparency is a big factor, in what we do. You're asking people to trust us with $170 billion of their dollars and their public safety. and their economic livelihood and viability of the state and the decisions that we make. And I mean, one of the things that my conference and I have long harped on, and I will continue to in the Senate, is this transparency. The idea that we will get a budget bill, and I already touched on the extraneous stuff that works its way into the budget bills, which is a travesty. It's wrong to do that business like that. But in addition to that, $170 billion, and we will get bills printed 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night. They'll literally still be warm on our desk and feet tall, and we're voting on them at 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. How do you do business like that, and then turn around the next morning and see people in the supermarket and say, trust me to do the right thing, when you're supposed to be given 3 days, not just us 3 days to look over a bill, but 3 days for the public and the press to pour through a bill and see what is and wasn't in there, what is and isn't funded, and kick the tires on it and tell us, we like this, we don't like this. I just think it's very arrogant for a state government to continually, every year, be surprised that April 1st follows March 31st. The fact that the budget deadline is April 1st should never be an emergency. April 1st has followed March 31st for hundreds of years. But yet every year, right around March 31st, we finally, we've got a deal, but now we need to have a message of necessity to waive the 3-day requirement because it's an emergency. To me, emergency is a volcano, a snowstorm, a hurricane. Not, wow, we didn't schedule our March correctly, and we're not going to be on time with this budget. And I think the public is tired of it, but I think that they've become desensitized to it. I think that the media has allowed this to become accepted practices, business as usual. Oh, they rolled their eyes. Oh yeah, they're late again, and they're doing an all-nighter. Last thing I want my 15-year-old high school kid to do is pull an all-nighter. He's not doing something right if he didn't manage his time. But that's a teenager. You cut them a little slack because a teenager will make mistakes. But legislators that are elected in the Assembly 130,000 person district, or in the Senate 300,000 person district, they deserve better than college kid all-nighters because we didn't manage our time wisely. And I think it's a real disservice to the voter and to the taxpayer to be given that stuff. And that is an ethics issue, and that is a transparency issue. And the thing is, that is one that is institutionalized, and it comes up every single year. And it bothers me, and it should bother the voters.
So COVID-19 has had a substantial and crippling impact on business owners and farmers within northern New York. What are your plans and initiatives to aid and assist these business owners in getting back on their feet and thriving again?
Well, I tell you, the last several months, I've spent a lot of effort traveling the district and meeting with business owners, and I've been to a lot of farms in particular, from Washington County all the way to Franklin County and everywhere in between. I think I've visited a farm in every county in the last several months. At least one farm in every county. And the stories of watching them, or hearing about them dumping milk on the ground because they couldn't move it. That's the old saying, right? Don't cry over spilt milk, because it is heartbreaking to see, and especially when you start to learn a little bit about what a farmer goes through to produce that milk, and under the best of circumstances, they might be breaking even. And then to see them have to dump thousands of tons of milk on the ground is heartbreaking. You know what? We need to shore up our farmers. We need to make sure that we're doing all we can to make sure that they have resources available to them. There's legislation out there that would go a long ways to protecting the viability of the farms. I think we need to make it easier for them to get their product to market. Whether it's through regulation and whatnot. Just the dairy farmer has taken it, and of course we just had a tragedy here up north in Clinton County where they had a bad fire on one of the farms, and they lost 400 head. Heart goes out to that farm.
All right, Dan. In general, how do you think the state as a whole has been handling COVID-19? As a member of the state Senate, how would you move forward in Albany in terms of the virus?
Sure. I think we did the right thing early on to amend the definition of what an emergency was. I mentioned volcanoes earlier, and I did that for a reason, because actually the state definition of what qualified for an emergency to give the governor these emergency powers, volcano was one of them. Pandemic and disease was not. All right, so I think we did the right thing to amend that. But when we did that, there was concern, not necessarily with this governor in particular, although I'm sure that was some of it, but just in general, the legislature ceding authority to any executive is always concerning, regardless of who the executive is. We moving forward, now I think while we're still in an emergency, the urgent part of the emergency, I need to make a decision, on hour to hour because we're not sure, we're through that. We've been through that for months now. So I see no need for the governor to have emergency authorities to change election law. We've been meeting, we're capable of meeting we've all met by Zoom. The legislature has convened and we've voted, we've held session under Zoom. So we can do it. So, if we need to change election law now, and I'm not saying that that's being offered, but I'm using it as an example. But by way of example, if we want to change the way that we're running our elections, involve the legislature. Unfortunately, the legislative majorities, the Democrats in the two houses, have not wanted to take that back. They're happy. I think they're content to let the governor have this authority, because with the authority comes the responsibility that, with this 20% funding cut that everyone's talking about, looking at, depending on what happens with the federal government, that it'll be the governor that needs to make the difficult decisions and not the legislature. So I think the legislature is content to let the governor take that heat, but that's us advocating our own responsibility. So I'm not sure, rephrase the rest of your question.
Yeah. So how would you move forward in Albany in terms of the virus?
Well, first of all, I still think that we need to go back and we should end the governor's, or at least curtail them and limit them and constrain them, and we could do that. If we do nothing, he has this authority until next April. Now, with that said, though, we need, the biggest reality now is we've got a funding problem. We've got a budget deficit caused by coronavirus, and the virus has increased spending. I mean, we are putting financial resources into combating it, so it's a double whammy. We've lost revenue because of needing to shut down our economy or slow down our economy, and we've got new expenditures that we need to address. And I think we need to get back into Albany, and we need to work on finding a way to fund our schools. The biggest thing I think is the rapid testing right now. The testing is both a financial issue for our schools. I just got off a Zoom conference with both the BOCES down here and the BOCES to the north, and the school superintendents are very concerned about the new protocols being placed in that. Everyone wants to do the right thing, but you can't wait 3 or 4 days to get a test and say, well, after 2 days, if you don't have a negative confirmed test, you have to assume positive. I can understand that train of thought, but unfortunately what that means is if no one's getting their test back in 2 days, then that means everyone that shows any sort of symptoms, cold and flu symptoms, that they are going to end up after 48 hours waiting, be deemed COVID. And so we're going to end up shutting down our schools. We're going to end up, all those parents are going to need to be quarantined. So we're going to shut down the economy again. And why? Because we aren't doing the rapid testing that we need to do. So that's a current issue with the schools. But even just over the last few weeks before that, in Essex Center in Essex County, in the nursing home, some of the testing that was going on there was being sent out, and they were getting that back 14 days later. What possible value does a 14-day-old test have? All right, to try to curtail the spread of a virus that within 2 days of you having symptoms, you've been infectious. So we need to make that a state priority. I think the number one thing that we need to do now in a COVID standpoint is we need to get our hands around rapid testing for our nursing homes, for our schools, so that we don't shut our schools down, because if we shut our schools down, first of all, now we are literally running the risk of ruining an entire generation's education. And on top of that, all the support that goes around, kids in school is an integral part of making the economy work. While the kids are in school, the parents are out working. If the kids have to be home, a large number of parents are needing to be home with them. And now you've shut down the economy again. And we can't afford to do that now. Then it becomes a reinforcing negative feedback loop where, now the economy's gotten worse, and we don't have the resources to go fight the virus. So we need to get our hands around rapid testing as soon as possible.
So also related to COVID, because of decreased revenue in the state,
Mhm.
towns like my town, I live in Hebron,
Mhm.
we're worried about receiving state aid for infrastructure projects,
Yeah.
for road repairs, for all that. But how do you? And I know one of your platforms is reducing tax burden and reducing taxes. But how do you accomplish?
That's just it.
You know,
So the pre-COVID, but it's still true now. Pre-COVID, the attitude, the mindset in Albany, unfortunately, was, we're going to say yes to all, and we'll just tax, and we'll collect the taxes. Now, in the economy that we have now, it's very mobile, and people are leaving the state. And the people that are leaving the state are the employers, are the wealthy, are the producers. We've had 1 million people leave the state now. Not all of them are wealthy, but enough businesses and business owners are saying, I'm getting hassled in New York. I'm being taxed too much in New York. I can do this in Pennsylvania. I can do this in the Carolinas. I can do this in Texas. And so the producers, the revenue payers, are leaving. On top of that, New York Medicaid, we spend more in Medicaid than Texas and Florida combined. A lot of people don't know that. I think if more voters knew that we spend how is that possible? Because Medicaid isn't the same from state to state. The states all have options available to them. And so New York has literally checked every Cadillac add-on option to Medicaid. We have the most expensive Medicaid program by far in the country. So that is a very expensive program to run. And one of the aspects about our program is we also say, if you're undocumented, we don't care, you're going to get these benefits here. Well, guess what? Not every state does that either. So we have become a magnet. Oh, New York isn't asking any questions, and New York is giving away the Cadillac services. So we have an increased demand on that, and yet fewer people paying into that system. So again, here's another negative cycle that's going on in there. So where are we going to get? How are we going to get out of this? Worst economy, worst economic business climate, the highest taxes in the nation. We need to get the economy growing, and we need to incentivize that by by not punishing businesses for staying here, and then then the revenues should come back. But you just can't say, well, we're going to raise taxes, because you're going to just chase away the people that are paying the taxes. Not sure if I answered your question, but all right,
good.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks.
you.
All right, so as someone who was stationed, in the Persian Gulf for Operation Desert Storm, which you have already touched on previously, could you describe to the readers and our viewers as well your stance on national security? And the second part to that question is, does national security outweigh the national debt crisis that we are currently enduring?
The second part first, you always have to live in a world of financial reality, fiscal responsibility. I mean, we have a $21 trillion federal deficit. Really not a state issue, but I'll answer the question as best I can anyways. You just can't, again, I'd love to say yes to all. I'd love to provide every possible program, but the pie is only so big. I saw that when I was a town supervisor, and I had 5 fire companies. And my dad's a retired forest ranger. The fire service is near and dear to my heart. They're volunteers. They're giving of themselves. Yeah, they do it because they enjoy doing it. There's a camaraderie. There's a social aspect to it. They get job satisfaction from doing it, but it's still dangerous. It's hard work. It takes them away from their families. It's difficult to be a volunteer fireman. And so I respect that. And I hated always being the guy that said, but the taxpayers will only want to pay this much. The pie is only this big. If you want to eliminate fire, then put a firehouse on every street corner, but who can pay for that? If you want to eliminate crime, you put a cop in every corner, but who can pay for it? So the same, we can't be all places at once on the globe. I saw that when I was in the Navy, and I can attest, personal observation, the globe is covered 2/3 water. I've been on a lot of it. But we do have an obligation, and our ability to protect our borders by having a presence overseas. There's a national security value in having a strong military. What was the first part of your question? I'm sorry.
The first part of the question is just, where am I at? Just, describe to the readers and the viewers why it's so important to you.
Well, I mean, clearly, there are bad actors in the world, whether they're states or whether they're individuals that are constantly seeking to harm us. On a personal safety level, the soccer mom, so to speak, soccer mom that I talked about earlier, that's concerned about police and public safety, but there's also our economy. Whether it's destroying a section of a major city that throws our economy, or a cyber attack that somehow attacks our economy. We saw what COVID did. It did not take long for COVID to cripple the world economy. A terrorist attack or some sort of external threat like that can easily have a crippling effect on our own economic health. So we need to focus on that, but it needs to be proportionate. We can't be all things to all people. We cannot be the world's policeman. So you do that through diplomacy and asking other countries to pay their fair share, and pull their share of the load. I think there's a lot of fairness in that, hey, you know what, you've got a functioning economy, you're benefiting from this, maybe you need to make an investment in your own national security. So you build those coalitions and whatnot, and I think that renewed light has been shed on that by our president. I think that makes a very fair point when he says, hey, why are we the only ones that are paying the bills for Europe's security? And because we can't do it alone. But nor do we want to contract into our shell and ignore it and say, well, our solution to that is we'll just ignore the rest of the world, because it will find a way, just like the virus did. It will find a way to come here. So we do need to have a presence elsewhere in the world. So I think it's in our national interest to keep it at arm's reach, to keep it across. And the oceans are two of our biggest security assets. Is that the proximity is not an issue. That we have two oceans that separate us from a lot of the trouble spots in the world.
Dan, what's your opinion on the Divide New York State Caucus's idea to split New York State into 3 separate autonomous regions?
The short answer is that, knowing Albany as well as I do, that it will never go anywhere. It just won't happen. Now, with that said, I certainly get the frustration. I understand what it is. It should be a wake-up call to elected leaders that there is a dissatisfaction with the way that the state is run. Now, I'm a believer in democracy. I took many oaths to support and defend the Constitution. I understand the concept of one person, one vote, and that elections have consequences, and 9 million people in one city in a 19 million person state should have and ought to have an awful lot of say so, and they do. With that said, though, people in Albany, the governor, my legislative colleagues, they should realize, hey, you know what? What these people that are saying, let's set up 3 autonomous zones, what they're pointing out is that they see an inequity. They see that New York City has its own set of rules, its own set of problems. These problems now need solutions, and then they get applied statewide. Good example, the SAFE Act, right? People in New York City, it's great politics in New York City. They don't like guns. They don't want guns. Get rid of guns. Well, guess what? Half the legislature comes from New York City. They bring that sentiment to Albany, and they say, let's eliminate guns. Let's pass more gun legislation. Now, around here, we don't have the same kinds of problems with guns as they did in New York City. We have a different experience, a different culture here. It's not perfect, but it is different, and it is not the issue that it is there. And so when you ignore that, when that feels disrespected and ignored, then they get frustrated, and they're like, you're passing rules for an issue that around here that doesn't really apply the same. It's a one-size-fits-all approach. Bail reform, the criminal justice reforms. There's a problem on Rikers Island. Then go hammer Rikers Island. Get to the bottom of that, investigate that, hold people accountable there. Don't say, well, we had a problem in Rikers Island, so therefore we must have a problem with corrections and the criminal justice system everywhere in the state of New York. So these are the resentments that people upstate are starting to feel. The disrespect, the tax cap. I'm jumping around issue to issue to say that it's not just gun issues and criminal justice. The tax cap. I get that the voters like the tax cap. I get that local government and schools don't like the tax cap. I know why. I came from local government. I understand the nuances of the tax cap and who it is fair and not fair to, and where it works, and bigger municipalities versus smaller municipalities. But lay that aside, and just for a second, the tax cap, guess what? That tax cap law was written, it does not apply in New York City. Guess what? Really easy to vote for a law that's controversial, that does not impact your constituents. So it's, I'm going to show that I'm a fiscal conservative and I'm going to go up there at Albany and I'm going to vote for a tax cap law, that I don't have to go back and deal with my constituents being upset about it because New York City's exempt from it. So people get that sense that, hey, why is New York City, they're exempt from, they tailored a law to be, to carve out New York City. Why didn't they do that for gun control? Why didn't they do that for criminal justice reforms? So that's where some of the sentiment is. Now, how large is that sentiment? Is a large number of people that want to create 3 autonomous states? I don't hear a lot. I get the occasional emails, and depending on how many people see our interview here, I may get more now. But it's not a constant. It's not a theme of this election. But I'm aware that sentiment's out there, and I understand it. But I'm also a straight shooter. I don't want to lead anyone along and say, yeah, it'll never happen. And well, it'll happen if you try hard enough. I'm telling you, the state will never carve itself into 3 autonomous zones. But what we hopefully will realize is that people are feeling ignored and disrespected because they aren't realizing that Long Island has its own nuances that are very different from New York City, and New York City is in many ways a very different world than the North Country. And it's our job as legislators that represent the North Country to bring that and articulate that in Albany. And I've been pretty good at that for 8 years in the Assembly. Betty Little has been fantastic at it for 25 years in the Senate and the Assembly. But that's where that frustration's coming from.
Yeah.
So pulling farther out again, what did you think of the presidential debate last Tuesday?
Yep.
Of course, you're going to be asked that.
Yep.
More recently, of President Trump's response to his own diagnosis of COVID.
Sure. I heard the first half of the debate on the radio as I was driving back south from a day in Clinton County. So I didn't see it, but I heard it. It was very difficult to listen to. And then when I got home, I caught the tail end of it, and it was equally as difficult to watch. To watch how it has devolved, our political discourse, is troubling. Interrupting people, calling each other names. I mean, I get feeling passionate about an issue or about a candidate. I understand not liking a candidate. I can't for the life of me watch 2 people that are running for the highest office in the country calling one a clown or constantly interrupting each other or telling somebody to shut up. I mean, I wouldn't, I would cringe if my 15-year-old did that. So it was a low moment, I think, in political history for our country, and there's plenty of blame on both parties there, and the moderator. I mean, maybe the moderator or the way that it was set up wasn't tight enough to begin with. But it was very difficult to watch, and I don't think there was a lot of value gained from it. There wasn't new information. It wasn't informative. So I don't think it changed anyone's minds, other than maybe they just feel more passionately about their like or dislike for either candidate or the other. Regarding the president and his his diagnosis, I mean, sometimes experience is the best teacher. In his words, I think he said, "I went to school." You can read about it, but to experience something, I think that's a valid point. So I think that he was there living it as a patient. That's a unique perspective and different than somebody that's in an ivory tower or somebody that's behind a desk, to be in there and have to be forced to live that in a hospital setting. Fortunately, his case wasn't as bad as certainly many cases have been. I think that somehow the severity of the virus somehow seems different than it was early on. I don't know why. I'm not a medical professional, but it seems that while we have more and more cases now, we don't have the hospitalizations or the deaths that we did. So I don't know if it's a combination of something's different with the virus or our treatments are better and we've learned a lot. I mean, I think there's probably some of both there. I think it's important for the president to lead by example and to share his experience with the country that he did. I think it's also important. There's value in him saying, "Hey, I'm alive. I'm okay. I'm working. I'm getting back to it." But just be mindful that that anyone, even the president of the United States, can contract this. As much as in a bubble as somebody like the president of the United States is, that virus doesn't care and it finds a way. And so to just learn from that and realize, we're still dealing with something that's very dangerous, and we can all learn from that.
Anything that we haven't touched on here that you would like to say before we conclude?
No. That's an inside joke I'll explain to you after. But no, I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you, and I know you said earlier 2 or 3 minutes, and there'll be people watching this saying, Dan is never good for 2 or 3 minutes, but I enjoyed the conversation and the questions today.
Well, I thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Taking the time. Yeah.